All right, here we go. Okay, so don't I look great? I get to be Jacob in the show. I've never been in a musical ever before. And in fact, I was asked not to be in one time in 6th grade. But they stuck me in it anyway. And I'm happy about it. It's so fun to be a part of it. And the kids are great. Gracie was my saving grace the other day. I was about to go on, and I had my beard down here on my neck just because it gets all itchy. And she said, "Don't forget your beard." And I was like, "Oh, no, I actually already did. I would have gone on without it." And unfortunately, she wasn't there yesterday afternoon show or last night show because I was up there for a scene, and I actually had my beard down on my neck and didn't know it for about a minute. And I thought, my beard. So not really good at this stuff, but a lot of fun. So I want to make some context between the story of Joseph. A couple of weeks ago, we did this with the story of Isaac when we did Jehovah Jireh, and we were talking about the story of Isaac and saw the context, and we read through the story and saw how much is in the Bible, all these stories that sort of foreshadow the story of Jesus, right? So we saw that. And so I want to do the same thing with the story of Joseph and just look at that theme, like what reminds us of Jesus, the Jesus story. And so obviously it begins with, we know that there's this special bond, this special love between Jacob and Joseph, right? He loved him with this special love. And of course that reminds us, right, of God who says at Jesus' baptism and also at the transfiguration, like, this is my son whom I love, right? And so there's this special bond of love. Now some people, there's one way to read this narrative of the story of Joseph that may see Joseph, and so I really love what Steve had to say at the communion. Awesome. But one place I might go a different direction is one way to read the narrative here is that, it's really not a good call, Jacob, to favor one of your kids. Right? I mean, that can cause problems, right? There's 11 guys who aren't being favored, and you got one being favored. That's going to be a problem. And part of that narrative is also looking at Joseph and saying, "Hey, Joseph, why are you rubbing this in their faces? Why are you doing this?" Right? And so, but I want to take a different tack on this narrative. I want to go backwards. I want to go backwards from what we know about Joseph's story. When we read about Joseph at his worst, he is a man of integrity, a man of character, a man of wisdom. He is a man that whatever he puts his hands to, God is blessing and flourishing. Is that right? He's there in Potiphar's house, and everything's going great for Potiphar, right? He's there in the prison. Everything's going great in the prison. He's there with Pharaoh, second to none, and everything's going great with Pharaoh in Egypt, right? Cannot we look backwards into the days before he was thrown into slavery and prison? Can we look back from that and say maybe this was going on in his own home all his life? Maybe he was always a person of character and wisdom. Maybe God was always blessing him and things were flourishing under him. Then take the fact that we know something about his brothers. Like, where are they at when they're supposed to be watching the sheep? Joseph goes out there, dad sends him, and he gets out there, and they're out messing around in town. And he brings back a bad report. No, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And we know that they're prone to envy and jealousy and murderous rage. We know that about the brothers. And so, I'm suggesting maybe Jacob's love for Joseph, this identification of him as special, maybe that was really warranted. Is that a far stretch? We know Joseph is that kind of guy. We know he's blessed all his life in everything he does. And so if we go backwards, Jacob could see this. And perhaps when Jacob gives him this beautiful coat, this many-colored coat, this radiant coat, when he gives it to him, it's really just a physical representation of of all of that brilliant glory that's surrounding his life anyway. That's obvious. When somebody, did Potiphar notice Joseph was different? Did the prison guard, warden, notice that Joseph was different? Did Pharaoh notice that Joseph was different? Then why couldn't Jacob notice that Joseph was different? And so this coat becomes sort of a representation that this one is blessed. And everything he does blessed. And not only is God blessing him, but he is living in that character of being someone who's blessed. So that's how I look at the coat. That's what I look at Jacob doing, is showing that God's favor rests on this one. Now, look at the Jesus story. Because just as Joseph was characterized by this aura of blessing, by this radiance of blessing, and the brothers reject him and they get mad at him and they want to kill him, right? Doesn't that happen to Jesus? We know that he was delivered up by his brothers because of envy, right? And John tells us in the prologue to the Gospel of John, he says, this word became flesh and lived among us, and we, what? Beheld his glory. As the glory of the only begotten of the Father. You can look at Jesus and he's shining with this radiance. The Hebrew writer says that he is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of God's being. That's Jesus. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. You see what I mean? Jesus is wearing this coat, this glorious coat of the blessing of God. And then the prologue of John also says, he came to that which was his own, and his own did not receive him. They rejected him, and they arrested him, and they actually killed him, right? So here's the story, right? It's the same story. Now, going a little bit more into the story. So Joseph, his brothers reject him. Jesus is rejected. He gets sold into slavery. He becomes a servant. I want you to just think of this. Joseph is living in Canaan with his father, in the promised land, in the blessings, and he's living there with his father, and he is removed. He leaves that place. He leaves the place where his father is. Of course, he doesn't leave by choice. But he leaves that place, and he goes to a place that's really different. Is that right? Completely different, foreign. Egypt is way different. The civilization is way different. Everything's different. You know, there's a pharaoh and there's all this, I think there's still pyramids and sphinxes and weird stuff. But anyway, he's in a completely different world. He leaves the world of his father and now he's in a completely different world. And there he's a servant, even a slave. Right? Anybody know where I'm going with that? Yeah. Philippians 2. Right? And Philippians 2 talks about this Son of God, this Jesus who didn't think it robbery, he didn't have to grasp on to like this being with God thing, but he left that place and he humbled himself in becoming a man, but not just a man, he became a what? A servant. So Jesus left that place where his father and he became a servant among us. I got to check, but I think I checked one time, and I think the word there is doulos, which is slave. I'll have to check. But anyway, he became a servant, just like Joseph. Now, Joseph, in becoming, in this new place, becoming a servant, Joseph was tempted. Day by day. I don't know how many days. Could have been 40. But Joseph was tempted, and he would not sin against God. Is that in Jesus' story? That's there too, right? When Jesus began his ministry, he was driven out into the wilderness by the Spirit, and he was there tempted of the devil day by day. We know that was 40 days. We don't know how many days. But it was day after day in Joseph's life. But he wouldn't sin against God. That's what he said. Not only that, let's see what else. So the brothers reject him. I know I'm forgetting one of them. Sorry about that. The brothers reject him. He's tempted. Okay, well, let's get to the backside of the story. The brothers come before him, and there's this meeting. There's this place. And what we have is the statement Joseph makes, and you know what it is. You meant it for evil, right? But what? But God meant it for good, okay? So here's the actions of humanity. You meant it for evil. They're doing it. But in those same actions of humanity, God brings about the saving of really not only Jacob's and his family. He saves Egypt. Did you notice that? He saves all humanity. He saves everyone in that land because the famine was going to hit everybody. They meant it for evil. God meant it for good. This is the point of the cross. Right at the cross, humanity's at its worst. Humanity is doing its greatest evil, rejecting the very presence of God among us. Saying, no, crucify him, crucify him. We meant it for evil. But in that very moment, in the very action of the cross, God is doing the most excellent action of love for humanity. Isn't that amazing? That's the connection with the story.
Randy, when you said Philippians 2, it says, who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross.
Amen. That's right. And so here's the connection. So now, so we find God's forgiveness in the same way that they found it. It's amazing, and they were amazed by it, that Joseph could love them and forgive them after all they'd done. And we find that same thing at the cross. Now, there's all those similarities, and there's probably more because I think I forgot some. Sorry about that. But there's a big difference. There's a big difference. You remember Joseph, you remember what he tells everybody when he's old, he's getting ready to die? And I love Jeff Walling did a sermon here one time, awesome on this. But do you remember what Joseph told everybody to do? Take his bones. He's like, when God delivers you, and I know he's going to bring you back to the promised land, and when he does that, I want you to take my bones with you. And so Joseph had this great hope. He had this great faith that God was going to keep his promises. And it says in Exodus when Moses and them are leaving, hey, we got to take the bones. They all knew this. They passed that down 430 years or however many years later. They passed that down. And so when it was time to go, they're like, well, we've been passing this down and now it's time. What do we got to do? We got to take his bones with us. Where's Jesus' bones? Where are Jesus' bones? They're not there. That's the big difference. Joseph's bones were still there. Jesus' bones aren't there. His bones are there. Here's part of what I forgot to tell you. The whole time in Jacob's narrative, the whole time, Joseph was dead. Right? Now we know the story, so we're not feeling that, right? We already know the story. We don't feel it. But Jacob's experience the entire time, his son is dead. And then when he gets word, it's like his son is alive again. It's a resurrection story. And so you have this death and resurrection in the story. You have this incredible forgiveness. You have this, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. It's the entire story. But the one big difference is Joseph's bones. They're there. And Jesus' bones are not. And if I went to the right one, which is a garden tomb, it's really cool there in Israel, I can tell you it's empty. And praise God for that. The last thing I want to share with you is really it's a little bit of an aside. It has to do with our story. And I've shared this in the class. I don't think I've shared this as from part of the pulpit, as a sermon. But recently we had talked about this in our Bible class. But when you're reading in the Bible, and you're reading in the book of James, you know there's a book of James, right? If you were reading the book of James in the Greek, it wouldn't start off with like Yames. That would be the J, and like Jesus is Yesu, right? The Y. Or Jehovah is Yahweh, right? James, that is not really a Greek word. It's not in the Bible. I know that sounds freaky, but James is not really a name. This word, I'm going to say the way it's pronounced. This word, as it starts in James chapter 1, it says Jacobus. Jacobus. What does that sound like? Jacob. This is a Greek form of using the name. It would be something like maybe what we would say Rick or Ricky, or maybe we say George and they'll say Jorge or something. It's just a little different, but the way the Greeks use the word Jacob. They're both based on the name Jacob. There's really not a James. And that's important because listen to the way this reads in this book if it was called Jacob. If you understood you were saying the word Jacob. Jacob, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Is there some meaning there to you? When you hear James writing to the 12 tribes, it's not quite the same as when you hear Jacob writing to the 12 tribes. You hear it? Jacob writing to the 12 tribes. And he says this, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials," here it says, "of various kinds." And this is what I want to tell you. The Old Testament was written originally mostly in Hebrew, some Aramaic. But about 200 years before Christ, it was translated into Greek because the Hebrew language wasn't in common use as much, and everybody was speaking Greek, and they didn't want to lose the meaning of it, so the 70 scholars got together and they translated it into Greek. So in the Greek language, if you were looking at the story of Joseph, and you were reading about this coat that Jacob gave to Joseph, this coat was called poikilos. Everybody say poikilos. That's how you would describe the variegated colors or many colors. This beautiful poikilos, the literal definition is amazing Technicolor dream coat. That's what it says in the Greek. Okay, so the whole everybody, all the Jews know the story. All these 12 tribes, they know the story of Jacob and the Technicolor dream coat. They know it. Now, Jacob, writing to the 12 sons, the 12 tribes, "Count it joy, my brothers, when you meet trials," poikilos. That's what he says. When you encounter poikilos trials, many colored trials. Do you see what he's doing there? He's referring back. Isn't that the story of Joseph? Isn't that the story of many, not just a many-colored coat, but many-colored trials? Isn't that the story of Joseph? And so Jacob is saying to the church, when you're suffering, when you're going through all these difficulties, and you're going through these trials, wear it like a glorious coat. Because you know that God is doing something amazing in your life and through your life. That's what we find out through Joseph. That's what this Jacob is trying to say to the church. Wear it like a coat. Wear it like glory. Because you know that God is through the testing that He's making your faith greater. He's making your testimony just louder to people. So, well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Well, God bless you this morning. I hope you get to see the show.